former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The deed is done. President Trump nominates Judge Amy Coney Barrett as the justice who would signal a whole new day for the Supreme Court. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. After years of a tenuous conservative majority on the nation's highest court, President Trump has now made an historic decision in the midst of a bitter election campaign, which promises to give conservatives control of the highest court in the land for years or decades to come. In taking just 1 week to name a replacement for the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it was no surprise that Trump selected a woman he long intimated would become his third nominee to the court following Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. And in Amy Coney Barrett, Trump has delivered a nominee who would turn the court from a fragile 5-4 conservative majority to a 6-3 alignment that all but leaves the progressive wing of the court out in the cold. Judge Barrett has been a rising star on the right, appellate court judge, originalist in the tradition of the late Antonin Scalia.
I clerked for Justice Scalia more than 20 years ago, but the lessons I learned still resonate. His judicial philosophy is mine too. A judge must apply the law as written. Judges are not policymakers, and they must be resolute in setting aside any policy views they might hold.
Judge Barrett, longtime law professor at Notre Dame, devout Catholic, mother of 7, including 2 adopted kids from Haiti, and just 48 years old, promising a long run on the Supreme Court. We'll talk about how we got here and how this appointment is likely to affect the presidential election now some 40 days away.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The president's nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court is now a done deal, but the real drama surrounding the sudden vacancy on the Supreme Court was not so much about who President Trump would nominate to replace the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because any of the 3 to 5 women who made the short list would satisfy the Republican majority and would almost certainly be confirmed if Majority Leader Mitch McConnell could hold 94% of his GOP colleagues, 50 out of 53. No, the true drama is about no less than a seismic shift in the high court, which is now on the near horizon. This is huge, much bigger than getting Neil Gorsuch or Brett Kavanaugh on the court, because those appointments simply tipped an already center-right court somewhat further to the right. This is a game changer. For the left, it's apocalypse now. As they see it, their most precious issues, primarily abortion, will now be endangered to a degree that they haven't been in decades, probably since Earl Warren headed the court as Chief Justice in the 1950s and 60s and led the court heavily to the left. And worse than that, the left has no power to stop it. They tried to beg the few vulnerable or moderate or Trump-hating senators in the GOP, but failed to land enough of them. And then they were reduced to doing what they've done from beginning to end in the Trump era. They threatened, said they'll exact revenge when they regain sufficient power one of these days by packing the court with additional justices sympathetic to the progressive cause, turning territories like Puerto Rico into states so they can add more leftist senators, eliminating the Senate filibuster entirely, and implying through it all that they can just snap their fingers when they regain power in the White House and Senate and make the long-term consequences of their own political misfortunes disappear. In short, because they lost, They will change the rules this country has followed for almost 240 years so it doesn't happen again. But while there was certainly worldwide attention focused on the Supreme Court, the height of drama this week was on Capitol Hill, where a head count of senators on when to bring forward a new justice commenced while Ginsburg's body was still warm. After 2 of the 4 senators needed to stop a nomination, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski publicly opposed going forward before the election. Arguably the most significant moment of the week came from a 3rd Republican senator who's feuded with Trump for years, Mitt Romney, who put Republicans over the top and carefully explained his reasoning.
I've indicated that what I intend to do is to proceed with the consideration process, and if a nominee actually reaches the floor, that I will vote based upon the qualifications of that nominee. You know, I think at this stage it's appropriate to look at the Constitution and to look at the precedent which has existed since the beginning of our country's history. And in a circumstance where a nominee of a president is from a different party than the Senate, then more often than not, the Senate does not confirm. So the Garland decision was consistent with that. On the other hand, when there's a nominee of a party that is in the same party as the Senate, then typically they do confirm. So the Garland decision was consistent with that, and the decision to proceed now with the President Trump's nominee is also consistent with history.
Think of the irony of Mitt Romney, the most outspoken anti-Trump Republican in the Senate, actually clinching Trump the votes he needs to move this game-changing process forward. This twilight struggle over the Supreme Court has caused a tectonic shift, like an earthquake, in the presidential race, where Joe Biden clings to a lead in the polls, but has now seen the biggest issue he's been pressing, the coronavirus, replaced in the headlines by the battle over the court. He came under immediate questioning about whether he would release his own list of potential nominees.
It's a legitimate question, but let me tell you, I'm not going to answer that question because it will shift all the focus. That's what he wants. He never wants to talk about the issue at hand. He always tries to change the subject. But let's say I answer that question. Then the whole debate's going to be, well, Biden said or didn't say. Biden said he would or wouldn't.
Let me translate that for you. He won't release his own list of potential nominees because most of them are liberals or progressives and can only hurt him politically as he tries to continue his high-wire balancing act between being the relatively moderate politician he's been for the better part of 47 years or simply a cipher, a repository for progressives who are actually calling the shots. Now, that last comment from Biden came in another one of those hollow, echoey, isolated settings with Biden wearing a mask so removed from any actual contact with ordinary Americans, I suspect fearful of COVID as well. But that isolation continues to be reflected in head-shaking gaffes that make you wonder about his apparent decline. Like earlier this week when he misstated how many have died from COVID while looking at a teleprompter.
Most cruelly of all, if Donald Trump has his way, the complications from COVID-19, which are well beyond what they should be. It's estimated that 200 million people have died, probably by the time I finish this talk.
Of course, that's over 200,000 who've died with COVID. And by the way, that's an important distinction, people dying with COVID as opposed to from COVID, because the great majority of those who've died were either aging and or had underlying conditions. But with the future of the court now added to the threat of 4 more years of Trump, the left is at DEFCON 1, out on the ledge, threatening to pull out all the stops. And over on CNN, listen to what Don Lemon called for in his conversation with colleague Chris Cuomo.
We're going to have to blow up the entire system. You're going to have to get rid of the Electoral College because the people...
I don't see it.
Because the minority in this country decides who the judges are and they decide who the president is.
But you need a constitutional amendment to do that.
And if Joe Biden wins, Democrats can stack the courts.
We didn't get our way. Ruth Bader Ginsburg died at the wrong time. The country voted the wrong way in 2016, so let's just blow up the system. So, what say we take a breath and take a step back in time, because with all the civil unrest and the pandemic and now a battle for the ages over the Supreme Court, there's a tendency to think things have never been this bad and wonder whether we'll get through all this. We'll tell you why history reveals that there's actually nothing new under the sun when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As widespread violence broke out following the death of George Floyd, and we became aware of the embedded ideology of the suddenly ascendant Black Lives Matter movement, one would have thought that the public's virtue-signaling affection for that group would be short-lived at best. After all, when the co-founders of an organization describe themselves plainly and unapologetically as trained Marxists, a red alert should immediately be triggered in the minds of all decent people. The idea of this inhuman ideology rearing its head afresh calls forth memories we all thought were buried deep inside us of the living hell rained down on a succession of great nations in the 20th century by murderous Marxist tyrants. This should do more than serve as just a warning to us all. It should send chills up and down the spine. Death camps and forced labor, secret police, unending hunger and poverty, unbridled corruption, the very destruction of culture and history and a way of life. Living under Marxism is undoubtedly the experience on earth most closely resembling Dante's Inferno. Why do you think the fall of the Berlin Wall 31 years ago triggered perhaps the most joyous worldwide celebration in our lifetime? And why do you think the Soviet Union simply dissolved itself and ceased to exist shortly thereafter? The world well recognized the consequences of ever letting such totalitarian tyranny rise again. But sure enough, this plague on the planet has risen afresh. And we can thank the savage criminals intercepting the George Floyd outrage and converting it to open insurrection in the streets. How can this possibly be? Well, as frightening, unprecedented, and incomprehensible as Marxism's rise from the ash heap appears, a look at the history of the last 3 centuries reveals the fundamental truth uncovered by the wise King Solomon in Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. Call it the 50-year itch. Every half-century, give or take, revolutionary fervor rises and threatens to violently overthrow an existing order. It seems not to matter whether the results of similar uprisings in the distant past had failed or been disastrous. If you rewind about half a century from this moment, you get to 1968, when an anti-American and race-fueled rebellion led to rampant violence in the midst of the Vietnam War and following the twin assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Everything we thought sacred was challenged as never before. Go back another 50 years, and in the heat of World War I, you find the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when Marxist-Leninist rebels removed and executed the Tsar of Russia and installed the first communist government in world history. More than 100 million people would die during the 70 years of Soviet tyranny, which spread its tentacles across the entire eastern bloc of Europe and emboldened radicals in our own land. The reverberations of that revolution have echoed down through the years right to the Black Lives Matter movement of today. We've all learned about the rebellion, which happened half a century before the rise of communism. America's Civil War, which finally secured the Union in 1865 at the cost of more than 1 million lives. many will forget or have overlooked the grave threat posed to this union 50 years before the Civil War, the War of 1812, when the British attempted to take back what they'd lost in the American Revolution. The Brits had the better of it for a while, burning down the White House, which was then called the Presidential Mansion, and driving inland, before finally succumbing and signing a peace treaty with their former colonial subjects in 1814. Finally, it was a half-century previous to that war when the fuse of colonial rebellion against the British Crown was first lit. Rioters protesting the Stamp Act in 1765 set the stage for a bloody war years later that won America's independence. Call it coincidence if you will, but an undeniable every half-century pattern of revolution fills the books of modern world history. This may provide little more than cold comfort to those of you shaken by the present progressive movement to destroy the heart of America. But it does prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the impulse to rebel against perceived injustice of any kind in the existing order is endemic to the human species. And most importantly, it provides hope for the future. We've demonstrated through radical uprisings and secession and assassinations and world wars and attacks on our homeland that we shall survive the existential threat before us today. We'll take a quick break and then dive deep into the effect of the Supreme Court vacancy on the presidential election.
Extra, read all about it.
Election 2020 Big Bottom Flash Reports are coming. On election night, at the bottom of every hour, LibertyNation.com will give you Election Night 2020, 90 seconds at a time, with our Big Bottom Flash Reports. You'll get the drop with our one-stop shop. We'll shed the light on Fight Night. Tune into LibertyNation.com on election night for our Big Bottom Flash Reports at the bottom of every hour. 90 glorious seconds for everything you need to know without the spin.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, only in 2020 could we live through a pandemic, widespread civil unrest like we haven't seen in half a century, mass unemployment, a frightening economic decline, all amid the most bitter political divide probably since the Civil War, and then see the whole narrative change dramatically with the death of a single Supreme Court justice. Here to analyze how this dramatic turn of events is likely to affect the presidential race is LibertyNation.com's outspoken political columnist, Joe Schaeffer. Welcome back, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Good to be here.
Well, always good having you. Do you think the fact that a new justice is likely to be confirmed before the election will have the same impact on voters as if the confirmation was done after the election, in the sense that the new direction of the court will already presumably be assured by the time people vote on November 3rd?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't think it matters for the simple reason that the circus is going to be the thing. There's going to be a circus. It's going to be worse than Kavanaugh, probably. Democrats always overreact to the moment. They try to seize the 24-hour news cycle. And I think this is where those past instances really catch up to them. The impeachment hearings, the Russia hoax, the whole laundry list. I think the American people are bracing now for the Democrats howling at the moon. And it's right up Trump's alley in that regard. I think it's the worst thing that could happen to Joe Biden. He's trying to pivot to the center, and here come the Democrats ready to act crazy again when he's trying to be Scranton Joe. It's not going to be good for him. it's the circus that's going to hurt him.
What's with the whole Scranton Joe line of thinking? I mean, the guy only lived there till he was 9 years old, and he's been in Washington ever since in politics.
You know, I think they're throwing anything at the wall now to see if it'll stick. Because, you know, this guy, and we've both been saying this, 47 years in politics, and you've got nothing to run on of your own. It's, I'm not Donald Trump. That's all you've got for a half century at the table of power. So I think it's an unfocused campaign. They're looking, they know they have to pivot away from that crazy leftist primary. And yet look what he did the other day. He alienated the Bernie bros. He says, I beat the socialist. He basically did a victory dance on you know, this is something that these people are deeply wounded about. They want to hold their nose and vote for the guy, and he's taunting them. You know, you don't have this part of the Democratic Party locked up. You really can't afford to do this. But I just think they're shooting aimlessly at the void now. They don't know how to frame this guy, because I think there is no safe framing for Joe Biden.
Well, that's certainly some excellent perspective. Do you think the future of the Supreme Court essentially replaced COVID in the minds of voters as a primary issue, which would, of course, be a serious problem for Biden? Or is the pandemic still likely to be a top issue?
You know, I really think that's largely a Democratic talking point. They want the COVID thing to be a decision maker, and I really don't think it is. You almost see a partisan split, whereas people who love the lockdowns and the mask and all that tend to believe in big government, trust the experts, and people who are prone to like Donald Trump don't trust authority. They're against this big government. So I think there's already camps here, and there's not this mass of undecided voters who are saying, gee, I really don't like how Trump has handled this pandemic. It's something that Democrats are trying to hold on to because, again, got nothing for Joe Biden. There's no reason for them to be optimistic about this guy. And I don't think COVID-19 is this winning issue for Biden like they apparently think it is.
Well, he's still winning in the polls, albeit less than a month ago. I mean, isn't that a reason to make him optimistic?
Yeah, I don't believe in the polls. And I think we learned in 2016 just how important these polls are. And I know you can't dismiss them all in a wholesale, but you need to look at what kind of person votes for Donald Trump and what kind of person. I mean, Joe Biden is the establishment. He's not just a Democrat. He represents a swamp uniparty way of government that ran roughshod over this country from 1918 to 2016. That's the COVID, the type of people who are prone to believe that big government is the answer and let's trust the experts. The type of people who really want systemic change in this country and are not leftist. I don't see how the coronavirus is going to turn them against Donald Trump. I really don't see it.
So the loss of the pandemic as any kind of issue for Biden, or likely loss, you can never predict anything in 2020, but that's going to hurt him, no question. But on the other hand, the court battle will also mute discussions beneficial to Trump about Biden and his son's dealings with Ukraine and China, which the Senate's been investigating, and the whole Russia collusion hoax, and the many far-left positions that Biden was forced to embrace during the Democratic primary. So who does the change of topic benefit and hurt the most?
I don't think it helps Trump as much as maybe some people think it does. They say the Republican Party is uniting around him. He's had strong Republican grassroots support all along, with 90% of Republicans in the grassroots have always backed him. So what Mitt Romney is on board, that doesn't change the election in any way. I think it hurts Joe Biden so much more for what I talked about earlier. This guy wants to go to the center. He can't win being the leftist progressive Trojan horse, as the Trump campaign that was such a good move painting him as that way. So he has to pivot away from that. And like I said, here comes the circus. Here comes the Democrats doing everything that they don't understand how much it turns off the mainstream regular Americans out there. They're going to do it on national TV. They're going to be hysterical. They're going to be over emotional. And I think it hurts Joe Biden because he does not want to be associated with this. And look at what he's been doing. He has really not been bringing up the Supreme Court thing at all. He's almost trying to avoid the issue. I think he knows, like, hey, this is going to get crazy, and I don't want to be part of the craziness.
Well, he's wise not to bring up his elections because that would only hurt him almost certainly politically, because they'd all be leftist progressives to satisfy his, the rising political base in the Democratic Party. But, Joe, let's turn our attention to Kamala Harris. What about her? Since most people believe she will eventually be the president if Biden wins, how much will and how much should the Trump campaign focus on her?
Well, theoretically, this is her big chance, her big shot at the brass ring. We saw her have this. She's going to be on the Senate Judiciary Committee for these hearings. Well, we saw her do that with Brett Kavanaugh, and she failed spectacularly. It is so important for her to perform. And if I'm a Democrat looking at the way she butchered it, and I think she butchered it with Kavanaugh, I don't see any reason to be optimistic, to tell you the truth.
Okay, so finally, Joe, everybody does seem to think that this debate coming up on Tuesday night, the first of what's supposed to be 3, plus a vice presidential debate, will be absolutely pivotal. Do you agree?
Potentially. It all depends if Biden has that disastrous moment. And Trump is going in there confident. They say he's not even practicing. He's going to go in there and just feel loose and do what he does. And I think what's going to happen, I think people are expecting the big Joe Biden blow up, the huge gaffe that's going to just ruin him. And I don't see him going out that way. I see him just slowly petering out. I see people watching him, and they're going to see a tired, just no enthusiasm, low energy guy, almost what Trump painted Jeb Bush as, except for, with a much older, more feeble man. So I think he's going to just fade away and fizzle, and there's not going to be this spectacular burnout. But 3 debates, it's such a tall order for him. I think the first one won't be the killer. I want to see him do all 3. I don't think he can pull it off, but I don't think there's going to be that one car crash moment. I think it's going to be more of a fadeaway. All right, Joe. On that note, thanks for joining us. We'll have you back frequently between now and November 3rd and after as well, if the election isn't decided for days or weeks or months after November 3rd. Thanks for joining us. Thank you. Joe Schaeffer, political columnist at LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have arrived at the ultimate section of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It's when we welcome back our regular contributor, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and the man we like to call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Great to have you. What a week for Supreme Court watchers, and you certainly are among that number. This is something that we've discussed, you and I, for the longest time. We talked about the Kavanaugh hearing and how I kept saying to you during that fight that it seemed that they had picked, the left, the wrong fight, because the Kavanaugh selection, taking over from Kennedy, moved an already center-right court a little bit more to the right. But because they tried to torpedo Kavanaugh, it actually cost them in the next Senate election, so that they had 53 Republicans instead of 51, and that's going to wind up being the difference here. So they pretty much sort of log-rolled themselves into a position where now when they really need to fight, where they really need to stop this nomination by President Trump, they're in no position to do so.
Yeah, between that and the Harry Reid elimination of the rights of the minority in the Senate when it comes to determining high-level court appointees, Tim, you have to say that that's exactly true, that the Democrats have, stabbed themselves basically in both eyes here at this point, because they're going to face a Supreme Court that is their undoing with much of their policy goals, I believe, if we look, sort of forward looking, if Trump does get that third appointee, and they are similar to the other two appointees with their judgments, that's what we have to look forward to. And it will be the Democrats' own undoing. So we've been hearing about this stuff now for a week since the sudden, it was a sudden jolt, although, of course, she battled cancer for years. So we've been hearing about this for a week and how it's a seismic shift in the court when you replace the progressive, who's the thought leader on the progressive wing of an minority wing of the court to begin with, and you replace her with the opposite, a constitutional conservative, shifting the balance of the court. We've heard all about how this seismic shift will occur, but I'm kind of interested in focusing on something nobody's talked about, which would be the lonely trio of Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, and how they're responding to all this. And they must feel like the Maytag repairman. Nobody's going to call on them, it seems. I listened earlier this week, Tim, to Justice Thomas's memorialization of Justice Scalia. And he talked about how in their 25 years together on the court, there were many kind of lonely times when they were in dissent together and hard days on the court. And I would imagine that's likely to befall those lefty justices as we continue on with the court, presumably, at 6-3 in terms of the ideology. Is the left exaggerating, do you think, the threat to these issues that they hold so dear? Let's focus first, like a laser beam, on abortion in Roe versus Wade, because they're scared to death that the rights they secured with a 7-2 decision in Roe versus Wade decades ago is now going to be endangered. Do you believe that it will come to the top of the agenda of this newly constituted high court to make a splash when it comes to abortion, if not completely overturning Roe versus Wade, at least affecting the issue in the direction of pro-life? Well, things have been going, sort of not their way for quite a while in terms of the pro-life crowd. I'm trying to think of a major decision in the abortion area that has gone for them or against the pro-choice. I suppose some of the Obamacare type mandate cases have gone in a pro-life fashion, but all the other ones seem to have broken the other way. So the answer to your question is yes, I would expect some dialing back of the types of protections that are included in the reproductive rights category that under the umbrella of Roe v. Wade. I don't expect Roe v. Wade to go away anytime soon, though. And that, Tim, is actually the hardest, I think, of the various sort of hot button issues that we might think of. I would say for guns, the opposite is true. I would expect an early gun case that's robustly establishes the Second Amendment as an individual right, perhaps inside and outside the home. And I would expect a lot of restrictions to fall by the wayside. So they're not all as complicated as abortion. And it's because of the way that abortion decision was crafted and its legacy. I think 73 is Roe, right? So we've had 47 years now of cases building on it, and it won't be quite so easy to dismantle, I think. But let's look at another angle on this, Scott, because, we see this sort of tectonic shift in the court in the near horizon. And yet, as you've pointed out on several occasions, 80% of the time or more, the justices either agree on a verdict or are unanimous in it on issues that you don't hear much about. There's a funny Scalia quote. A lot of these Scalia friendship moments between he and Justice Ginsburg that have occurred publicly have been popping up this week. And one of them was Scalia saying, "Oh, she's only bad on the sort of hot button issues." And there's truth to that, which is to say there are so many more voluminous issues in the law that somebody like a Justice Scalia and certainly Justice Ginsburg can enjoy sinking their teeth into as an exercise in their that's their vocation and their passion is these legal questions. It's not just about, this policy of, 5 hot button issues.
So let's conclude by bringing up something that would become an issue if Trump does win re-election, which is the more elder members of the conservative or constitutionalist wing of the Supreme Court. You've got Clarence Thomas, not so young. Is it possible that this would be an opening in a second Trump term to replace Thomas with someone younger and conservative?
Well, if Justice Thomas would agree to that, then yes, it is, Tim. I would imagine that he might learn something from Justice Ginsburg's example, which is that, you don't want to probably go out under a president whose policy prescriptions you may detest. And I imagine, why roll the dice at that? But at the same time, Justice Ginsburg said she would do the job as long as she could, as long as she was sort of playing with a full deck. And I think most Supreme Court justices, Tim, think that job is the best job going and don't want to leave it unless they have to,
Does this Trump nominee replacing Ginsburg remind you a little bit in terms of the dramatic nature of the shift of when Clarence Thomas replaced Thurgood Marshall?
I haven't processed it that way, and I think it's partly because of the other circumstances that surround this, this incident, which is the ongoing nightly riots in so many American cities, the looming election, and sort of threats to the republic. So it's all swirling around out there,
isn't it? Though. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose. All available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. And don't forget our new Roku channel. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.